My husband's lover and I both had cancer. She was faking it, but I really had it, yet my husband, Levi Miller, didn't believe me. Later, I was captured, and the criminal said, "Call your husband. If he comes, you will be safe." But my husband only said, "If you want to come back, just come back yourself. Don't expect me to pick you up." He personally pushed me towards death. When my skinned body lay in the morgue, he didn't realize that the dead person was his wife who would never make trouble again. Mr. Miller, a female corpse has been found, matching the methods used 3 years ago. Levi gripped his phone tightly, his face serious, while the urgent voice of an officer came through the line. Ella, sitting next to him, sensed his emotional shift and gently tugged at his sleeve. "Levi, what's wrong?" "Ella, they found a body. If you're not feeling well, you don't need to go," he said, looking down and gently patting her head, his eyes full of concern. Ella shook her head and said firmly, "No, I want to go with you. This is my duty." I floated in the air, watching this scene, feeling a slight pain in my heart. Upon arriving at the scene, Ella immediately got to work. She carefully examined the body, her brows furrowed, her expression focused. I watched her, feeling a mix of emotions. Ella looked up and said to Levi, "This body has been dead for more than 3 days. The method is almost identical to the case from 3 years ago." Upon hearing this, Levi's face grew even more serious. He slightly frowned, carefully observing the body, not knowing if my current appearance was ugly to him. He saw a missing piece in my lower leg, and I felt a wave of tension. Then I shook my head and laughed at myself. Now that my skin was peeled off and I was unrecognizable, how could he possibly identify me? An officer asked curiously, "Mr. Miller, did you find something?" Levi collected himself and shook his head, "Nothing." I scoffed. As expected, he didn't realize it was his wife who had been missing for 3 days. I mocked myself inwardly. In his heart, I was never important. "Send it back to the morgue first, and then conduct a detailed autopsy," Levi said, pulling Ella back to the police station. On the way back to the station, Ella suddenly mentioned me. "Levi, I haven't seen your wife for several days." Levi's eyes flickered for a moment, then returned to normal. "It's fine. Last time I went to see you, she was arguing and said she was leaving home." Ella's eyes flashed with a barely noticeable smile. "You should still call her." Levi didn't respond immediately. He seemed to hesitate. Seeing this, Ella said, "I'll call." She called, but it was met with a busy signal. Ella frowned. Could she have blocked me? Upon hearing this, Levi's eyebrows furrowed, and his tone became somewhat harsh. "Don't bother with her. She's always paranoid." I wasn't paranoid, just dead, unable to answer the phone. Was that my fault too? I stood in the air, watching all this, my heart full of helplessness and bitterness. My body was quickly transported back to the station, and Ella personally performed the autopsy. I watched her quietly, feeling a mix of emotions. The preliminary autopsy report came out that day. The DNA report would come later, being expedited. Levi stood before the report, his gaze fixed on the word cancer, a flash of panic and disbelief in his eyes. He walked to an empty corner and impatiently pulled out his phone. He opened the chat interface between us. The last message was from 3 years ago. I couldn't help but remember that after Ella came back, we never talked again. Levi typed for a long time, then closed his phone without sending a message. He instead called my best friend. "Is Isla with you? Tell her to come home when she's done making a fuss." His tone carried a hint of impatience. Hearing Levi's tone, my best friend snapped back, "I was going to ask you. I haven't been able to find Isla for 3 days. 3 days? Levi's pupils dilated slightly, and he hung up the phone. He reopened my contact and called directly. He was met with the same cold busy signal. At this moment, Ella walked over. "Levi, let's go eat. We've been busy for so long, I'm hungry." Her voice was gentle and sweet, but Levi shook his head. "I still have things to do. Next time, okay?" I floated in the air, watching him speak so gently, feeling a pang of bitterness. I followed Levi home. Levi suddenly started searching around the house. I didn't know what he was looking for. Suddenly, he found many medications in my bedside cabinet. Back then, to keep him from worrying, I lied and said they were vitamins. What he didn't know was that these were all anti-cancer drugs. Maybe it was my fault too. I lied so much that he believed it. The day I left home, I told him I also had cancer. But he said with disgust, "Do you even have to copy Ella in having cancer?" At that moment, I was disappointed. So, I didn't even have the right to have cancer. Levi picked up the medicine bottles and looked at them over and over again. As he read the labels, his expression grew worse and worse. Just then, Levi's phone rang. "Mr. Miller, Ella fainted again. She was just taken to the hospital." He froze for a moment, then pocketed the medicine and rushed to the hospital. I stood in the air, watching him leave, a wave of inexplicable sadness rising in my heart.